fiction. I've actually read one of these at an open mic, so I will start with that one. It's called Almost. Before the crack epidemic reduced all inner-city neighborhoods to stereotyped catchphrases, things were good in the almost hood. Picture the early 1980s in the heart of the Rust Belt, Fort Wayne, Indiana. The major industries were still open. Regular men with good jobs were employed at International Harvester, various foundries, General Electric, places like that. Some drove to Ohio to work in automaking industries there. With a 10th grade education or high school diploma, a man could make $18 or so an hour, take care of a family, and have a good life. And that was how we lived then. 7 kids and 2 parents and 3 crazy dogs. Just another black family on a block, mostly full of similar families, although only 3 or 4 seemed to have fathers present. Also, there was a very large white family down the street on the other side, the daughters of which liked to instigate fights with the tougher black girls on the block. It was the neighborhood's excitement when they exchanged yelling across the street. And there was a Mexican family around the corner. But we knew who we all were, and even when we got on each other's nerves, we still liked where we lived. The houses in the Winter Pontiac corridor then were mostly 2-story former farmhouses built circa 1840. I knew ours was. There were only 2 ranch-style houses on the block, and one of them was haunted. We were middle class. The houses were kept painted, the grass was cut, and big cars, Ford LTDs, Lincolns, Oldsmobiles, and the occasional Cadillac, and my mother's Pontiacs and Mercuries, graced the curbs and the driveways like colorful, lazy sharks. They would glide into place with the smooth, heavy rumble of big and small block V8s, the perfect undercurrent to the music pouring out of the car's speakers. Across the street from us lived a family whose last name was Black, which I always found giggle-worthy for its irony. Anyway, they and the folks on the corner in the white, yellow, and black house with the huge driveway and my family were all 2-parent homes, and it seemed like the fathers were all in a quiet quest to have the best cars, the best and newest electronic equipment, but all the parents were friends. I always liked the Blacks' house. It was shaped identical to ours, 2-story, wide porch, 2 tall upstairs windows like a pair of rectangular eyes. But the Black house had the best color, a sedate olive green with a subtle orange trim around the porch overhead. And Mrs. Black kept well-nourished plants, just a few, hanging from the hooks in that overhang. It looked cooler over there. Not that ours was bad, but by the time I was old enough to be cognizant of anything, our house had been painted an uneventful tan. In pictures, I saw that it had been a pretty white and red, with red bricks down to the foundation out front. I did like that we had cement pillars adjacent to the steps. They made for great places for Barbie to sunbathe or for kids to sit after the kickball game had gone on too long and we needed to rest. At any rate, one day the Blacks had a visitor, a young relative from the South, Mississippi to be exact. He was roughly my sister's age, 18, and everyone, Mr. and Mrs. Black and Mr. and Mrs. Miller, well, at least Mrs. Miller, thought the two should meet. His name was Eric Jackson, I think. If I wanted to be exact, I could look up obits and crime reports, but his last name almost isn't a concern here. The point was, he was tall, chubby, dark-skinned, and had a huge Jerry curl afro that he wore a white sun visor over. He frequently wore light blue jeans, white gym shoes, and red tank tops. In the one picture we have of him sitting on the hood of a car, he is wearing a short coral necklace. Also, in hindsight, he doesn't look as comical as my teenage siblings made out the day we all met him. But as time would tell, we would be better off having some distance between ourselves and Eric. My brothers, athletes all, except one who was a drummer who lifted weights but was mistaken for an athlete of some kind, took no pity on Eric's soft form. His heavy Mississippi accent didn't help either. After a visit from Eric, I remembered my siblings in the kitchen, with 3 of my brothers imitating the way Eric said our sister's name, Reba. In Eric's pronunciation, it became Reba. Man, that dude is country, my second oldest brother, Bill Jr. pronounced one day. I giggled. I was more than likely removed from their secret teenage happenings immediately. That brother was on his way to continued wrestling stardom and would be second in the state by the spring of 1983. He walked around with his shirt off as often as he could. The youngest brother, 10 years younger than Bill Jr., would follow his athletic footsteps exactly, football captain, wrestling stardom, weightlifting craziness. I could feel everyone's dislike of Eric. Mostly, I knew they liked to tease Reba with thoughts of her future with Eric. A future in which there would be grits for breakfast and roughly 12 children. Little did we know that a life with Eric would be anything but funny. So we grew up. Even Eric. He gave up on my sister, who dated other people and went away to college. No one heard from or even thought about Eric again until the late 1990s. The brother of mine who had been a drummer and avid weightlifter in high school, Mark, grew up to be a master mechanic. Everyone on the southeast side of town knew where to get a transmission or engine installed for cheap. He did smaller jobs too, all of this out of the garage next to his tiny house on Bowser Street. One day, Mark and I were talking at his house, probably about one of my rolling wrecks and what it needed to get fixed. And Mark said, "You remember that big country dude that used to like Reba from when we lived on Winter Street?" I thought for a minute, Eric? Yeah, well, he's opening a car lot, and he stopped by. He said he wants me to do some work for him. Is he still country, I asked. He dresses good, got rid of the curl, in better shape, still has that accent, though. We laughed and indulged in some back-in-the-day Eric imitations. Are you going to do it, I asked. Mark shrugged. I'm kind of busy. I'll see. And that was that for the moment. After the Era saga concluded finally, my youngest brother told me that Mark had done work for Eric, had represented his interests at the Indiana auto auction to get cars for the lot. Without the rest of the story, such seems of little consequence. As the 20th century drew to a close, life in Fort Wayne became more violent. Plants were closing, International Harvester was gone as a major employer, and the drug business was thriving but dangerous as ever. By 1995, Fort Wayne was named the crack capital of the Midwest, and Peter Jennings came to visit for an ABC News broadcast. A few years later, Eric was in the news and on everyone's tongue when a drive-by shooting at his house killed his young son and nephew. It was pretty much understood that the shooters were not after the kids. So that was when we learned that Eric was a drug dealer, and not just a small-time stand-on-the-corner type either. Bill Jr. told us later that Eric had started selling drugs shortly after he arrived in Fort Wayne. He looked at us like we were stupid at a holiday gathering. Y'all didn't know? He Ben had a franchise. Then he laughed, imagining country Eric as a drug kingpin. I was shocked. Eric had arrived during a sort of second wave northern migration, and a lot of our neighbors were from Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. A recession of sorts had hit the South, and everyone seemed to come north for industry work. For whatever reason, such work was not enough for Eric. After the murders of his son and nephew, Eric was the grieving father and uncle in Fort Wayne newspapers. The next time we would say anything about him, Eric would be dead. Whoever Eric had angered was not content to kill those closest to him. They found his car lot, the lot with the garage where my brother had been asked to work, the car lot that was a front for his drug dealership, and they killed him and his mechanic. It always gives me a sick feeling to think how it was reported that the mechanic was killed. My palms sweat a little. That could have been my brother, trying to do a favor for a guy he knew a long time ago. When my younger brother Sam and I talked to Mark about the whole Eric thing, we always scold, "You could have been killed." Mark nods solemnly. I know. What I call the Winter Pontiac corridor isn't much to look at anymore. A few years after my dad died, my mom sold our house to the city, which, after city representatives used the house for their purposes, tore it down. We moved to the suburbs. Nothing is in the place of our house. The houses that flanked ours are rental properties. I doubt if the residents know very much about each other. I can still see ghostly images of the cars, hear the music, Al Green, Sugar Hill Gang, the Brothers Johnson, Eyes of March, Earth, Wind and Fire, see snapshot visions of the fathers who would get sick and in many cases die too soon from decades in industrial conditions. Can witness the antics of the crazy dogs, all who lived long lives. And I think about the day a boy from Mississippi came across the street from my sister and almost got us all killed. Almost.